I want to go ahead and welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Natasha Croom, and I'm an assistant professor of higher education at Clemson University, as well as your host for the ASH 2018 Woke Research Methodology series. Under the presidential leadership of Indiana University professor Dr. Lori Patton Davis, the theme for the Association for the Study of Higher Education 2018 annual conference is Envisioning the Woke Academy. This series is among several efforts to realize the theme and call attention to the need for more critical exploration of policies, practices, and experiences of people across post-secondary contexts. This series is designed to encourage us to consider the current state of higher education research and the extent to which our current body of knowledge and inquiry practices are, in a simple word, woke. Before we move into the interview, let me share some logistics. We ask that all attendees make sure your devices are set to mute. We have quite a few registrants for this webinar and want to make sure that we have as little background noise as possible. The first half of this discussion is organized around a predetermined set of questions for Dr. Covarrubias, while the second half will serve as an opportunity to take questions and comments from the audience. Please use the chat option on the bottom of your screen to type in your questions. We'll be monitoring them throughout the webinar, and we'll get to what we can during the latter part. We, of course, welcome your thoughts via social media as well. Please use hashtag ASH2018 or hashtag The Woke Academy to interact with us via Twitter. And of course, as always, if you're joining us, let us know who's with us today in the chat box. We'll give you a little shout out as we go. So again, thank you all for joining us for the third episode featuring Dr. Alejandro Covarrubias. Dr. Alejandro Covarrubias, an Angeleno and sixth child of Mexican migrants from Jalisco, engages in praxis that confronts the persistence and pervasiveness of white supremacist American institutions and policies. Specifically, he interrogates intersectional structural subordination of the educational opportunities for individuals in distinct racialized spaces. He is uniquely interested in the experiences of students who have been pushed out of high school, the policies that lead to removal, displacement, criminalization, and commodification of brown bodies, and the community-based organizations that re-engage high school pushouts or dropouts in alternative public educational settings. Dr. Covarrubias is also founder and former executive director of Los Angeles Communities Advocating for Unity, Social Justice, and Action, an East Los Angeles nonprofit that is widely recognized as a model for meaningful engagement of vulnerable populations and community transformation efforts, especially for those formerly pushed out of high school. Alejandro, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Croom. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. So let's start with a question that is central to this series. When you hear the idea of woke research, what does it elicit for you, and how is it represented in the work that you do?
Sure. So first, let me just start off with a little critique of the notion of being woke, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think you and I had an earlier conversation about this. Part of the critique is that the notion of being woke suggests that you've already achieved this state of consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, one of my concerns about using the language of being woke is the idea that we can gain awareness and that's enough, right? But for me, it's more about a joke that I tell my students, a running joke is I tell them, I don't want you to be woke, I want you to be spoke. Because I want them to speak up. I want them to do something, right? It's really about doing and being. And so while I still understand the whole notion of doing woke research and trying to do progressive work, I do think I do that, right? And part of, for me, what it is making my work accessible, usable, and really to serve as a participant in the movement, right? I've talked to you earlier about how the work that I do, I don't see it as community engagement, and I don't see it simply as research. I see it as movement building. And that's not to suggest that I'm building the movement. It's to say that I'm working with movement builders, and I want to be an active participant in those existing movements and community spaces. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
So as you just said, you're participating in this with others, right? This idea of movement building, and you would describe yourself as a movement builder. So can you expand on that a little bit more in terms of what does that mean more specifically, and why would you, right, choose to do this work of movement building in the context of higher education specifically?
Sure. Well, you mentioned in the intro that I've worked with high school pushouts and that I've worked in community spaces. And so I spent quite a bit of my career, the last couple of decades, actually engaged with programming in community spaces and organizing in these spaces. And in that process, I really have come at it from an asset-based community development perspective, where it involves building up from the bottom up, right? And while I'm here in higher education, I also feel that the classroom that we offer our students isn't relegated to the classroom itself, right? And so we go into community, and I speak about this notion of being in community with folks, right? Being in community with our local neighbors, right? And for me, part of this work is about moving beyond the walls that exist within the academy. It's building other folks up. It's extending ourselves as participants and being active in existing movements and building bridges. So for me, it goes beyond having simply a research agenda that is about pursuing a particular intellectual interest. I think that's great and it's meaningful for the type of work we do, but it's not accessible to the type of folks that I've worked with for the last couple of decades. And so I try to find ways to engage them in the discourse that we're having here in academic spaces. I also feel like I'm a Freudian, right? So I feel that education is a space for liberation, but it also can be a place where, as one of our community partners said, is we send our young people to come back and to learn how to come back and take advantage of their communities. So we have to be careful, and I think we have a role as scholars to see and reflect on those things that we can change in these spaces.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. So, one of the things that I think makes your work so intriguing is that a lot of it, you know, in a lot of it, you're primarily engaging with what we might consider quantitative methods.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, for many people, when they think about, critical scholarship and, right, and being furry and being in and with communities and, um, those two things don't always, right, like readily connect in folks' minds. And so, how did you actually come to engage with the methods that you do, and why for you are they the most appropriate for the movements that you're building with others?
Sure. So I think I'd like to probably start by sharing some of the work that I'm doing with students, and then kind of work my way to the question, right?
Mhm.
Currently, I'm working on I'm teaching a course called Latinos and Social Justice, Latinx folks and Social Justice. Right? And in that course, what we've done is with one of my colleagues, Dolores Delgado Bernal, is we partnered up with various community organizations and trying to build a model of how we work in community with folks in reciprocal relationships with them, right? But part of it is I came from these spaces, right? Because most of my career in academia I've spent as an adjunct. I've only recently moved into a tenure track position, and so most of my work was actually in community spaces, right? And so part of the one of the most recent nonprofits that I worked with, right, was this Inspire Institute of Service Learning, Power, and Intersectional Research, and it was working with high school pushouts to re-engage them and to teach them how to do research and for them to be able to create the narratives from their communities, right? So that meant for me that I had to, when I was in that space, define how I wanted the university to work with me, right? Rather than have the university come and mine our community for data come and pick up the latest lingo and interject it into our research, right? I really wanted to see what do we need? What is meaningful? How can we fight policy issues in our neighborhoods, right? And so that's what we started to do in this class, Latinos and Social Justice, right? And so initially we started off with this broader theme of desaparecidos, right? Which I'd mentioned to you, right? There's a long history in Latin America for the state to use disappearances or kidnappings and removals of disappearance, a complete elimination of people who are deemed subversive or undesirables, right? And we've seen tens of thousands of people disappear. And the idea is that it's worse than death because your family has no closure. And so we started to think of how does that occur here in the States. And so we started to, in the first class, look at the policies of the new administration and the way that they were disappearing folks in our community, right? And what could we do in those spaces to confront that, right? So what we decided to do is to disappear somebody, you can reappear them, reaparecidos, right? Reaparecernos. And that meant that we had to reappear folks with dignity. So some of the students started going into Adelanto, which is a detention center here in California, started getting stories of folks, right? And then we started doing these cutouts. I don't know if you could see some in the background back there, cutouts of people's stories and putting them throughout the campus, right? Because the idea was to occupy space, right? So that was appropriate for that particular project, right? And then we moved into, okay, let's examine what, we started working with another group called the Youth Justice Coalition. That's an abolitionist group here in LA, amazing community organizing work for the last couple of decades. And so what they've been doing is they've been working with families whose family members were killed by law enforcement because of the overuse of force, right? And so they've gathered data, the names of people from the year 2000 to 2017, and they wanted us to help them analyze those cases. And so we got about 400 the DA reports, right? Which investigate the killings. And so we're reading through these detailed stories, these narratives of really executions, right? That the state is deeming justified, right? For that particular piece, we thought that if we mapped it, we could identify death zones. And I think you have that map if you want to show it. Yeah. So that was appropriate for us, right? It meant that there was a way for us to show folks who, we already knew this, right? We live in these communities, so we know where the death zones are, right? And we started to identify where are people most likely to get killed. And out of the 848 people that had been killed in those 17 years, we're seeing really clear patterns, right? So you can see here that in South LA, the Harbor area and the East Side, which are predominantly communities of color, these were the death zones, right? So we thought, how do we get this information to people? And obviously maps are an accessible form, right? We also, I think you have another one that I shared, which is the Long Beach, you could share the Long Beach homicide report. Here we started doing one specifically by race and then community, a specific community, and then we could identify where in particular are folks most likely to get killed by law enforcement, right? And then maybe you could show the last one, the preliminary one on race. And then here we started to see again the pockets, and we could see like it might be difficult for you all to see the distinction between. Well, actually, we did change it. So Latinos, you can see, are in the blue, and then black is in the kind of peach color. And so you could see where these concentrations are, and a lot of them are overlapping in our communities, right? So our neighborhoods, they know this, right? How do we use this as a way to give folks the tools to fight back, right? And for instance, the Youth Justice Coalition, that's what they do, right? They engage in direct action. While we may not do that ourselves, right? Well, what can be our role in this movement that they've been working on for decades and that I personally have participated? Now as a researcher, how do I go into these spaces? The last one that I did want to share is the map app RIDE project, which is a MARC project I told you. And in that project, in the MARC project, well, actually, this is another one we did. This is the educational deserts, where if you look at once again, if you look at the concentration of where people are getting killed on the east side in South LA, the death zones they overlap pretty well with the high school push-out zones, right? What we're referring to as educational deserts right now, for lack of a better term, right? But once again, our communities, they recognize these as accessible forms of looking at information, right? I don't know if do you have the other one, the PowerPoint with the pie chart? Because I think that one might be a good tool to show. Because again, part of my work has been trying to evolve the way that we create accessible information, right? Accessible data. So here you can see, actually, if you could go to the one, can you go up a little bit on that one? I'm not sure if it's possible, but if you can, what you see is that you have the traditional pipeline that I've been using in some of my work, my earlier work. And now we're starting to think of how can we think about it in terms of a pie and access to a piece of the pie. Our communities recognize that. That is meaningful quantitative research. That moves away from needing statistical packages to determine whether something is significant, right? Our communities know this is significant when they see a piece of the pie that gives you access or does not give you access to higher educational opportunities, or it gives you different types of access than other folks. That's really clear. That's something that they could build around. That's something that they can move. And so for me, that's part of it, right? Lastly, the last one that we're working on, my students and I, is the MARC project, right? The MARC project was this effort to, and once again, it's dealing with local issues that are happening now, right? Last year, there was a young woman last July who was killed by her partner. And she was 19 years old. Her partner was 31. Her name is Nancy Maderos. And her partner was 31. And both of them were students here at our university. And he happened to be her tutor. So many of our students were dealing with this. And we were talking on campus. A lot of people were talking how we hadn't really done anything big to draw attention to this. And so we said, well, why don't we start looking at the forms of violence that happen on university campuses toward women? And then that eventually evolved to gendered violence in our talks and our collaboration with other scholars as well, right? But what we ended up doing is we ended up requesting through a Public Records Act, the students did request to the incidence of gendered violence on campus to the university. So we started to go through that process. They also created an app where students can anonymously report, or anybody can anonymously report incidents of gendered violence on or around campus. And then lastly, they organized a ride / march across campus where they brought resources. They brought people, not only for community spaces, but here on campus to once again draw attention to this issue and to be able to give people access. And even the students are amazing, right? One of the things they did is they did a circle for men during that ride as well, where it was an accountability circle, and men got to talk about masculinity and how it's how traditional masculinity is incite and a part of the rape culture, right? And so so for us, it was really about engaging what is happening locally and making our work meaningful to others, but driven by the questions that they have. So I literally went to our community orgs and said, what would you like for us to find? What research would you like for us to do? And this data is not ours, this data is yours, right? We just want to engage in the process of helping you. And so we got a lot of pushback because some people didn't want us to collect research and told us that was, they saw it as snitching, right? And collecting data on our own communities was destructive. And so we worked with them in other ways, right? That were appropriate for them. Once again, it's I do quantitative work because I think it's something that historically we've been taught to fear, right? It's been removed from us. It's something that it's very accessible in our communities, and we use quantitative approaches differently in our neighborhoods, right? People measure things all the time with numbers, right? People understand space. Young people understand maps. Young people engage in maps. They have a map and a computer on their hand all the time. So for me, it made sense that we would draw on that and use it because it's appropriate for what for the folks we're engaging.
You know, one of the things you talked about when we talked before was about this idea of like decolonizing quantitative approaches.
Yes.
And so, you know, using that idea to really talk about, as you just said, right, the ways in which we've been socialized to either fear numbers or, right, think that when we, you know, and you know, when we were talking the other day, I was thinking about, you know, the kind of fear that as I work with like my students, for example, you know, doc students who are like, oh, I'm going to do qualitative work. And you're like, okay, so, you know, do the questions that you have and the issues and concerns and problems of practice that you have, you know, there are other methods, right, that might be more appropriate for trying to answer those questions that you actually have. But, right, like, how do we begin having these conversations about, like you were saying, the fear that, you know, even the word quantitative in and of itself, like, elicits for people in these spaces. And so I thought, you know, your conversation between the two of us about really trying to decolonize this idea of, you know, the numbers and quantitative approaches was really helpful and thoughtful and insightful. I don't know if you have anything else that you want to share about this in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally for me, it's there's a couple things, right? One is about you often hear from students, right? I'm not good with numbers. I'm not good with math, right? And at some point, if you investigate that, you start thinking, what does that mean that they're not good with math, right? Or not good with numbers? If you mess with their money, they're good with numbers, right? If you ask them about particular data about their high school push-out rates, they're good with numbers, right? Our students know these things that are meaningful in a practical sense, right? And I think part of what happens in academia and just professions, institutions, right, is we create certain types of language that make those things inaccessible. And in making them inaccessible, we exclude people from discussions, right? And I think initially, when I was thinking of how to engage the notion of intersectionality through quantitative methods, right? I thought about different types of advanced modeling and whether that was, but I also knew that many folks from our communities wouldn't have access to that, right? And wouldn't care for it and would be actually blocked from it, right? And so numbers have historically been weaponized against us, right? So how do we use them to work with movements, right? How do we use them as tools, right? So for me, it's more about, so part of it is right, removing ourselves from thinking that statistical significance determined by a statistical software is more meaningful than our experiential significance that comes from our lived experience, right? Where I think I showed you the maps earlier, where I showed the high school push-out rate of Northern California, the Central Valley, and then Southern California. And Northern California is predominantly known for its financial district and its high-tech industry, right? The Central Valley is known for its agricultural industry, right? And cheap labor, right? And so when you look at the 15 points difference in the push-out rate between these two communities, do I need a statistical package to determine whether that's significant, or can I just talk to folks, right? And can they tell me what that 15% means, right? when they begin to aspire to be the cashier, because that's the only person they see in a position of power, right? As one of my colleagues did growing up, man. Now she has a PhD, right? These are structurally designed. These are communities to produce a certain type of worker, right? So we can understand that through numbers, right? We can understand that by showing numbers in different ways. That's why, to me, the original educational pipeline that I had participated in for scholars, right? I thought, well, how can I share with folks in my community that wouldn't think of it in that way, in that linear way, but more so can think of a piece of the pie and how much opportunity you actually have to go to college and to get a degree. That makes sense to folks, right? That to me is about, and just going much further into our own histories about how indigenous folks in these lands use numbers and use space and use geography to really understand their world, understand their spirituality. And I think part of it is us reconnecting to those. So this is what I'm saying, right? That this slideshow that you're showing now, right? This is the traditional pipeline, which I think has been a very useful model for those of us that are in academia that allows us to see trends, right? And places where people are pushed out of these institutions. But this is a bunch of numbers to many folks that may not necessarily be interested. They want to know the story behind that number, right? They want to know what that 46%, why is that so different in Potterville in the Central Valley compared to the Bay Area, right, in San Francisco. But if you go a couple more on that same PowerPoint, you can keep going to I want to go to the circles, right? So this was another way of showing it, right? If you advance this just till it gets to the completion, part of what I'm trying to get us to think of is how from the associate degree, that yellow area, all the way through to the doctorate degree, that's a piece of a pie, right? That's a slice of the pie. California Latinx folks have what I would say is a decent piece of the pie there, right? But keep going on the slideshow. So here you see, if you look at East LA, look at their piece of the pie. This is a community that's 95% Latino, right? Has historically been a community for newcomers of Latinos, right? Continue. This is Inglewood, historically Black community, right? One of the places in our map that's one of the highest points, death zones, right? Go on. Another one, Florence Firestone, historically Latinx community that is also on the death zones. Right? Compton Willowbrook, historically Black and brown. This one's 50-50, smallest piece of the pie, right? People understand that, right? People understand this concept of having a piece of the pie, and it's different. It means something different. You could go to the last one. Now, when they see the piece of the pie that Beverly Hills has, right? Mm-hmm. Then it makes sense, right? Then those other numbers that we were showing earlier make sense that somebody's eating our lunch, right?
Right.
And so we want a piece of that pie, but we have to start thinking about just the construction of the pie, who made the pie, and what's in the pie and who's it for, right? So I think that for me, that's engaging in quantitative methods that are grounded in the questions that communities have and ways that communities can engage. So.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm gonna ask one more question before we turn it over to the audience to see what kinds of questions they have for you. Before I do that, I see that we've got a number of folks out there attending, folks from Wellesley, from CSU Pueblo, Oakland University, UC Davis, folks from the South Dakota Board of Regents Systems Office are on with us. My friends over at IU and UGA and NYU. So if you have questions, please feel free, throw them in the chat box or use the Q&A box on Zoom. So, Alejandro, as you think about your own preparation to engage in or do research, what germane advice would you give to those of us grappling with what doing research and engaging in scholarship means, both in academe and beyond, particularly if our goal is revolution?
Yeah. Well, I think first is this notion of doing research, right?
Mhm.
And part of I have this presentation I share with my students of it's called my critical race fairy tale, right? And then I talk about how I grew up, and I talk the question that I raise is um, why we be well, my question, why we do the work we do, and
Mhm.
really the question really should be why we be the work we be, right? And and for me, it's not, it's, this isn't work, right?
Mhm.
This is a lifestyle, right? This is a life decision. And so advice that I would give to folks that want to be um, this type of researcher or this type of movement builder, I
Mhm.
would say you have to create it, right? You have to build it. We're not going to find um, these spaces in higher ed because they don't exist. Because by design, um, we're often pitted against some of our best accomplices, right? Those folks that we need the most and they need us the most often are pulled in directions that frankly, sometimes we don't even see them coming, right? And we need each other to highlight those things for us when it gets in our blind spots, right? Uh,
Mhm.
but so I would say the biggest advice I could give folks is build a community, um, and that community shouldn't be a community that's only grounded in the university,
Mhm.
because that reifies the distinction between our university community and our local communities. Your community and your movement building should really cross these spaces. Um, so there are folks out there, right? It feels lonely, and there are going to be folks who, as I told you before, will be your friendolegas, and then there'll be folks who are part of the movement, and you know they're part of the movement, and you engage different, but we all have a role in a larger aim for revolution. And I'm not sure what that revolution will look like, but I know that it's coming, and
Mhm.
I want to be part of it.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like I'm in the spaces to be part of it.
Mhm. Mhm. So I want to take a few questions from the audience, and we've had some grad students who've been working behind the scenes who also had some questions as well. And so, one of the things, um, one of the grad students working with us asked is, so some scholars are interested in doing community-driven justice research, which is, I think, how they're, understanding the work that you're doing.
Sure.
And so they ask, more specifically, how you define community-driven justice research, and what characterizes that type of research, and what makes it distinct from other types of community research.
Sure. So I think there's a couple things, right? First, I start off with this idea of you need to build community to do any of this, right? That's central to our work in academia or in community spaces, right? So when I use the term community and working with community or working in the community, I see those very different than working in community, right? For me to work in community is to simultaneously be working toward the building of a community while working on the struggle that that community defines, right? When we work in the community, I think we are often distinguishing ourselves from being a member of that community, right? Community doesn't just happen, you have to build it, right? So for me, community-driven scholarship is that scholarship which is created by you being in community with folks addressing issues that are relevant in those spaces, right? And those communities and the spaces shift, right? So I think you can be in multiple communities engaged in this type of research. And so what makes it different, I think the difference is that I see myself as part of these communities. And I build community in these spaces that are relationship driven, right? I'll give you an example, right? And part of the Critical Race Intersectional Think Tank, which is a group that I belong to, that amazing scholars that have been really supportive, and really they're a family, right? One of the things that we consistently talk about in that space is how the most important thing to our work is the relationships, right? Are the relationships, because the publications will come, right? But the publications will come, or if the relationships are strong. If we know that if I know one of my colleagues is not is struggling, then I'm struggling. Okay? And I think we have to see it that way, and we have to build these pockets of communities that then begin to create what I refer to as a network of resistance. I mean, that's where these aren't disconnected spaces, right? We got to be intentional about how we connect them. So I don't know if I answered your question, but that's.
I think you did. So, again, one of the areas that, you are engaging with, right, is critical race and intersectionality, and intersectional research. And so one person said, it's a hard task to conduct intersectional research well. What would you say are the most important things to consider when planning, conducting, and analyzing research through an intersectional lens?
Well, I think that you have to, I think of intersectionality in different ways, right? So intersectionality in terms of, the traditional, or what I think most folks are using in terms of the constructs, right? The intersecting of constructs. I think of it more broadly as intersecting of what I call trinities of fear, right? Which are ideologies, systems, and constructs, right? I think when we only focus on the construct and remove it from historic ideologies that have institutionalized themselves into systems with policies, practices, procedures that occur on a day-to-day basis, I think that it becomes less relevant for me, it becomes less relevant, it becomes less intersectional, becomes more traditional research that relies on traditional distinctions that are made without having a real critical analysis of how those distinctions were made and what they mean for our day-to-day material conditions, right? That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in transforming people's quality of life, not simply the symbolism of what people think about us.
Yeah. Let's see, we've got some more questions for you. Sorry. So one question is coming sort of back to this, like, building of communities and being in relationship with people. What strategies do you use to ensure you're engaged in reciprocal relationships in community with folks outside of academia and not reaping, maybe they mean solely reaping, the tenure and promotion rewards while conducting research?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a couple things, right? For us, we've tried to come up with acuerdos, right? Those are agreements with the folks that we work with. And so we've done that not only with our community partners, but even with students, right? We have a research team. We call ourselves Critical Race Intersectional Praxis and Transformation. It's called CRIT. And so our work is about us telling the tales from the crypt, which is our tales, right? Our stories from our neighborhoods of people who are disappeared, and we want to reappear their stories with dignity, right? So, so in terms of, so remind me the question. I'm sorry, I went on a.
So strategies for ensuring the
Oh,
reciprocity.
so sure. So for me, there's a couple things, right? One of them is in anything that we write, we've made the commitment to strategic authorship. Right? And what we refer to as strategic authorship involves looking at, among scholars, it means something different, right? Because among scholars, we know how people need to publish and when we need to publish, right? So the strategy is different. But I think for community spaces, we feel that community folks should be first authors in the work that we do with them. Because that's valuing the work that they're producing, the knowledge production that's occurring, and where we're learning it from, right? Because I've been in community spaces for a long time, and I learned of terms there long before academics start publishing and using that terminology, right? And so for me, it's about honoring those spaces. It's about bringing the resources. There's a particular group we work with, the ovarian cycles. And one of the things they often remind us of is about liberating resources of the university for community spaces, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's part of our reciprocal relationship, is for us to, when we bring a community scholar to campus, that we treat them as an academic. And if we give honorariums to academics, we give them an honorarium, right? That when we, I mean, all the little things, right, that we do for other people who are deemed in this society as having been educated and knowledge producers, we should do that for our own community folks. So I think part of it is coming up with clear agreements with them about why you're working with them and what they can expect from you, right? And meeting those, right? But also being realistic about what you can offer them, right? Don't offer people things that are unachievable and then fall through, because I think that's the biggest critique we get in these spaces, is that people come in and they don't follow through, right? That's the first one. The second one is, of course, people are making careers out of our work, right? And so I think honoring the work and where the work is. So that's why when I said earlier about how I see my work as movement building, I'm not saying that that I'm creating the movement, right? Because I know those movements exist, right? And so for me, I saw another question about thoughts or suggestions. I think Monica Gutierrez, I could see, right? I said about, like, once you get a PhD and you've been grounded in a particular community, but you get a gig somewhere else, then what do you do, right? Well, I think you become engaged in that community, right? There are folks who are building community everywhere, right? And so, like I said, in academic spaces, it's difficult for us to think of because it's such an individual type of project. I mean, it doesn't have to be, right? But that's the way that they try to teach us to be, right? So I would say you have to be an authentic, and I shouldn't use that word because everybody's going to ask, what do you mean by authentic, right? But I think you have to have real, grounded relationships with folks that you work with, right? Yeah. And honor what they bring, and don't overcommit to things you can't do.
So another question we got is particularly around like methods. And so it says, I'm curious about the focus on storytelling and partnership. Does this imply the need for qualitative research methods as well? And does this work need to be mixed methods in order to contextualize the quant mapping?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, right now, we just put out a piece in race ethics in education in the journal, and then we're putting out a chapter for a book that's coming out on critical race quantitative methods as well. But in those pieces, I mean, that's what we're arguing. We're arguing that you have to have a mixed method approach, and even we make the argument that the whole idea of that I mentioned earlier about experiential significance is that testimonials can give us experiential significance, right? And that we have to draw from these stories. Our quantitative research for me is good at helping us draw big patterns, right? Seeing big patterns and telling our stories within those patterns. And I think that's what the pipeline did, the original educational pipeline, right? It allowed us to see where institutions were failing particular communities, right? And so then we started to tackle those specific questions, right? I think absolutely that you can never you always need to have qualitative methods honor and provide meaning to quantitative work. And I think we know that even before any of the work we've been doing, right?
Right. Another question, are there any primary texts that you would recommend for teaching quantitative methods from a critical lens?
Yes, I would. So I think the piece that Ash did a couple years ago, well, I think in 2015, I thought that was pretty good. I think the REE special issue that came out in, I think it was November, is pretty good. It's a collection of folks. The next one that's coming out, the book by Tandika Chapman. I know she's the lead, so I'm sure you'll be able to find it, but it's Critical Race Quantitative Methods. Lessons from the Field, I think it's referring. It's the subtitle. And I think anything by Zuberi, right? Anything and everything by Zuberi is like a must, right? I think everybody should read Zuberi and Bonilla. So.
Have you seen I assume the Critical Race Spatial Analysis book also
yes.
came out?
Absolutely.
Also.
Yeah, and the work of Veronica Velez and Daniel Solorzano, I mean, that work is instrumental to my work. I mean, I draw from them all the time, and those are the folks that taught me how to think of spatial analysis and use it in movement building work. So.
And then we'll take one more question. So what creative or non-traditional approaches have you taken to sharing your findings?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways. I mean, we've done different things. So I think I told you that we created an app. I don't see, I'll try to find it, but we did a QR code where our students created an anonymous reporting app for the campus. And so what they started to do is we work with this group, the Ovarian Cycles, and we started to do different things, right? They do t-shirts and they do stuff like this, which are, I guess, things that they wrap around their face, right? And we did one with a QR code, right? So that people can access that and then go and participate in telling stories, right? We've also done these community projections, right? So with that particular group too, with Ovarian Cycles, we did a ride across different communities where we highlighted the places where people have been killed in these death zones. We had projectors with us, so we were riding along with car support for the riders. They do an annual, but they also do monthly Luna rides, which are the moon rides. They've been doing them for years, right? So what we did is we collaborated with them to go and project the data of the death zones in different places. So we projected them, for instance, at Hollenbeck Police Station, right, on their wall, right? And so as community folks are walking by, they could see they're one of the most killingest divisions in the LAPD. And so people are engaging the research, right? And we're talking about it. Recently, my students went to, there's a woman in South LA who opens up her home to do open mics, essentially, right? That's mainly poetry, right? But my students went and present this research, right? Because they thought that it should be in that space. And so they took it. And so we're trying to be creative with these pop-up projection projects that we're doing, right? where we're going into community spaces, working with local folks, letting them know. But that's what the Long Beach one was. Remember I showed you the Long Beach map with specific areas? Well, working with those folks in those spaces that can use that data to organize themselves, right? And some of them who are already organizing, right? All we're doing is giving them an additional piece that they can use in their organizing and hopefully participate.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
All right, so my last question, which I'm asking everyone. So, as you may be aware, some woke identified folks like to wear message t-shirts. So if there was a t-shirt designed with who you are and what you stand for in mind, what would it read?
Oh, wow. Okay. So first off, I should say I have my guayabera on, but I have a message shirt underneath. So I always kind of, it's funny because I always tell my students I love t-shirts, right? Just because in community spaces, when I work with youth, they always design the t-shirts and came up with some amazing, like creative ways of telling the story, right? And so for me, I think though my particular shirt would say wannabe. And I think it's about me, like, I think because part of it for me is I'm always crossing different spaces, right? And I'm always wanting to be a participant in those spaces, right? And but the biggest thing I want to be is I want to be a revolutionary. I don't know what that is, and I don't know how to do it, but I'm trying, right? And I'm seeking the folks to help me, and I'm hoping all the folks in these community spaces that I work in can help me get closer to it.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome. So with that, I'll say thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm grateful to you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom. I'd also like to thank those who've been working to ensure that this series happens. So at Indiana University, Veronice Sanchez, Wendy Ferguson, and Elise Smith. Also Melanie Harris at Clemson University and Nia Grimes at the University of Georgia. If you miss Lee Patel, Kakali Bhattacharya, and you want to rewatch Alejandro, these are being recorded. We will have closed caption on them, and you will be able to access them through the webinar registration site. Also, don't forget, this is a series happening once a month leading up to the ASH conference. So please join us on Wednesday, June 20th from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where our guests will be Dr. Ezekiel Dixon Roman. And lastly, we hope that you all can join us as a member or a visitor for ASH 2018, which is November 14th through the 17th in Tampa, Florida. You can register by visiting www.ashe.ws and by clicking on the conference button. Again, thank you so much, Alejandro. I really appreciate your time and your energies and your efforts. And I'm sure that our listening audience also really enjoyed this. I appreciate you.
Thank you. And I look forward to building with you.